Hi, I'm Joe Stark, creator of the fantasy adventure series The Unscarred. If you like what you hear today, be sure to like, subscribe, and share. Now, on to the show.
On the world of Faereyas, a god made flesh is born every 500 years. These beings are known as the Chosen, but the world will come to call one of them the Unscarred. The Unscarred, written by Joe Stark.
Chapter 9. The Key in the Path. Althenia examined the illusion. Her nostrils flared in disgust as she regarded Salat's visage. From within his portrait, the old man stared back at the young woman, his smug expression still wordlessly reproaching her for daring to question his spellcraft. The truth will be laid bare, Salat, and history will remember you as the fraud you were, thought Althenia. She suppressed the urge to smile as she savored the irony. The old charlatan had always been so consumed with his legacy, and now, years later, one from his own bloodline conspired to tarnish his precious fabrication. "What do you think?" asked Hawk. Althenia indulged herself with a smile as she turned toward the young heiress. "It's certainly an illusion," she replied. "But what does it conceal?" Hawk shook her head. "I don't know yet," she answered. After reading Althenia's treatise on illusion spellcraft, Hawk had once again visited the lower vaults. To the young librarian's surprise, Hawk had offered her an opportunity to work with the heiress as her assistant. The pair now sat opposite each other on the wooden floor of the training space in Hawk's rooms. Their bodies were at rest, still and composed, while their minds occupied Hawk's memory of Ordwak's suite. "Yet," repeated Althenia, raising an eyebrow. "When you told me you needed an assistant, I'd assumed it would be more clerical in nature." "Two questions. Why me? And what's your plan?" asked Althenia. "Why you?" replied Hawk. "Your treatise. The fact that it was suppressed, and you were effectively punished for writing it, relegated to the lower vaults on my father's orders. Considering this, I would find it highly unlikely that you harbor any sentiment or loyalty to Ordwak." Althenia nodded in agreement while Hawk continued. "The illusion is controlled by a physical key. We must first reverse craft a replica construct. I will need your expertise to do this. Then, once Ordwak's suite is unoccupied, we use the key to deactivate the illusion and see what he is hiding. The premise is simple, but executing the plan will be tricky," said Hawk. "His suite is rarely empty, so tomorrow morning's conclave meeting is our best option." Althenia's eyes widened. "That doesn't give us much time to make this key." Hawk nodded in agreement. "Tricky," she repeated. "Ordwak is scheduled to preside over the conclave tomorrow morning. He never misses those sessions, and it'll be at least a month before the duty again falls to him, so we must act fast. While Ordwak is occupied with conclave business, Warren will be alone in the suite. I must physically enter the space, so I'll need you to distract Warren and draw him away from his desk, then alert me before he returns." Althenia chuckled at the audacity of Hawk's plan. Simple, but tricky. Hawk again nodded in agreement. "Are you with me?" She pointed to the energy nexus just outside the boundary of the illusion. "If we can untangle and make sense of this knot, we can make a key." Althenia once again turned her attention to the illusion. "Let's make a key." Hawk smiled in satisfaction. Time was short, but she was no longer alone in her endeavor. Eric awoke suddenly, jolting upright from his momentary slumber. He was seated on a stone bench on the terrace overlooking the valley of the Mantis. He gripped the cold stone of the parapet and peered into the murky darkness, searching for any sign of smoke in the forest below. The early hours of darkness had yet to be pierced by the morning sun, and he could see little from his lofty perch. Eric felt eyes upon his back. He leapt up from the bench and spun to face whoever had stealthily approached from the deep shadows of the darkened terrace. His heart hammered in his chest as he scrutinized the space around him. Beyond his powers as a chosen, growing up as an orphan on the streets of Lant had honed his survival instincts to a razor's edge. He knew with absolute certainty that he was not alone. Eric glanced from side to side. The terrace had 4 stone columns capped with metal braziers, but the pots were dark and cold, their fires extinguished. The young chosen spoke a word of power, and the fuel within the braziers blazed into life, casting flames high into the air and lighting up the darkened space. Eric blinked as his eyes adjusted to the brightness of the fires. In the rear corner of the terrace stood a man. Eric's vision came into focus, and he saw that it was Ian the Herald. "Ian?" asked Eric in confusion. The first of the chosen stood with his hands clasped behind the small of his back. He was as still as a statue as he silently regarded the young chosen before him. Silence hung heavy in the air around them as the pair stared at one another. Eric felt unease growing inside as Ian continued to coldly gaze upon him. As though sensing the young chosen's discomfort, Ian suddenly smiled and held his hands out, palms raised open and empty to show he meant no threat or harm. "Worry not, young one," said Ian as he slowly approached Eric. He placed his hands upon Eric's upper arms and gently squeezed. Eric nearly winced at his touch, so cold were Ian's hands. "Events move apace, and the path do you yet walk," said Ian, his voice sounding distant and hollow. Ian continued to grasp Eric by his arms. The young chosen felt his muscles begin to cramp as the coldness intensified and spread down to his forearms. Eric suddenly jolted awake. His crossed arms were resting on the frigid stone parapet. He sat up and looked around as he rubbed his cold arms. The fires burned brightly within the braziers, illuminating the terrace. Eric was alone. He tried to shake off the strangeness of the encounter as he stood and stretched. Like his previous meeting with the first chosen, it had happened during a dream state. Eric was sure that it hadn't been an ordinary dream. It was Ian once again reaching across the void of time. He sat in quiet thought as he stared into the darkness hanging over the valley of the Mantis. Eric heard the soft patter of approaching footsteps. He turned around and looked over his shoulder. It was Galen, but the Motavi was absent from his usual armored garb. Instead, he wore a loose-fitting white tunic and dark trousers. Bedclothes, if Eric had to guess. Perhaps he wasn't the only one unable to sleep well this night. Galen approached the parapet and gazed up at the night sky. The stars shined brightly overhead. The constellation of Caruso stood prominent in the center of the sky, the old god of Faereyas holding his celestial shield aloft, forever frozen in the sky, ever in defense over Faereyas. Galen didn't need to ask if any sign from Hoke had been seen. The spotters would have blown their horns had they seen smoke. As Motavi, I should dissociate myself from those worries beyond my control. It is a disservice to my people to be so wasteful with my focus, said Galen, his quiet voice breaking the silence. From what I've heard, you're one of the few who have survived the most lethal of the dangers within that valley, said Eric, nodding his head toward the forest below. Galen smiled briefly and nodded. Yes, that is correct. Then you know the dangers more clearly than most, replied Eric. Galen silently pondered the truth of Eric's words. Only myself and another, stated Galen. There are only 2 among the Ka that wear the black. What was it like? Asked Eric, facing a black mantis. Sudden and fast, replied Galen. Its stealth and speed were incredible to behold. How'd you survive where so many others have failed? Asked Eric. What was your edge? Galen again smiled briefly. I've heard Kasich say that only those with an edge can survive a black mantis. He's right. Eric nodded. He waited in silence, content to let Galen continue when he was ready. I've always had a certain way about me, said Galen. Extra senses. I can sense the truth, and in some instances I can also sense danger. and with it comes a measure of understanding. When I encountered my black mantis, I sensed its attack and dealt my killing blow without seeing it. I drew my sword and swung on pure instinct from the understanding I gained upon sensing the mantis's presence, said Galen. It's hard to explain properly how it feels. Eric chuckled. That I can relate to. Galen smiled. I suppose you could. And what of the other Ka that defeated a black mantis? Asked Eric. What was their edge? Kaluka Ka, Motavi of the Ka, and Monmotavi of Karas Din. You will meet him soon enough. Once you've seen Kaluka, his edge will become apparent, said Galen with a wry smile. Eric nodded in acceptance of the answer, and once again the pair fell silent as they continued their watch over the valley, knowing it would be morning soon. Hoke shielded his eyes from the morning light. The previous night had passed by without incident. Not wanting to miss the sight, Hoke watched with a cup of coffee in hand as the sun dramatically appeared over the eastern cliff line. First only a sliver of pink light, which soon grew to a dome, culminating in a blazing ball of brilliant light, illuminating the lands spread out below. The rosy morning sunlight painted the heights of the western cliff line in soft pink hues, deepening the natural reddish ochre color of the sandstone walls. Hoke gave a soft whistle at the sight. The Valley of the Mantis may well have been one of the deadliest places he'd ever visited, but it was also one of the most beautiful. Hoke's morning bliss was interrupted by shouting from Daleth as the red-armored Ka emerged from the surrounding trees. What in fuck is this? Asked Daleth as he stepped over the cooling circle of ashes from Hoke's perimeter fire. Hoke drained the last of his morning coffee and reached into his satchel, his arm disappearing up to the shoulder as he rummaged around. He extracted his arm and pulled forth a small parcel wrapped in wax paper. Hoke unwrapped the paper and presented a small meat pie with a flaky pastry crust. He maintained eye contact with the young Ka as he took a bite. It's breakfast, Daleth, said Hoke, speaking around a mouthful of food. He crumpled the wax paper into a wad and tossed it into the campfire. The paper writhed and twisted before darkening and erupting into bright yellow flames, their flickering tongues springing to life, consuming the paper and leaving only a fragile shell of white ash. You want a muffin or something? Asked Hoke. Fuck muffin, exclaimed Daleth indignantly. Hoke laughed around another mouthful of food. Let's leave your mom out of this, yeah? I'm sure she's a lovely woman. Daleth again shouted in Ka and kicked Hoke's legs. Hoke continued to laugh, but put up his hands in mock supplication. Yeah, I know. Absolutely uncalled for, said the Farron before stuffing the last of his breakfast into his mouth. Up now, cock bitch fuck, growled Daleth. Those are certainly naughty words, my friend, said Hoke as he gathered his kit. Let's work on proper context and usage next. I no want be here, Kata, scolded Daleth. We're here because of you, asshole, said Hoke, jumping to his feet and knocking his coffee mug into the smoldering campfire. The last of the dregs spilled from the cup and dripped into the bed of white ashes, sizzling as it touched the still hot bed of coals beneath the ash. How is it my doing that we've seen no sign of any mantises? I've still got all this shit all over me, yeah? Said Hoke, motioning to the painted markings he'd received prior to entering the valley. You point me in the direction of a mantis, and I'll hand you its fucking head, said Hoke, shouting the last. Daleth continued to grumble in Ka as Hoke finished stowing the rest of his kit. He reached into the remains of the campfire and extracted his coffee mug. It smoked and felt hot to the touch, but it didn't burn his skin as he brushed ash and glowing embers from the side of the mug. Hoke wrapped his hands around the outside of the cup, momentarily reveling in the warmth as it spread into his cold fingers. Before. Hoke and Corso sat in quiet contemplation, listening to the fire as it crackled and popped. Flames flickered and danced along the burning logs, sending wisps of glowing orange embers floating toward the star-strewn dome of sky overhead. 3 days before, Hoke had summited the peak near Terransay and presented his stone to Corso, earning the title and rank of Ranger First Class. The next morning, he and Corso had begun their journey through the small range of mountains north of Terransay. Corso hadn't told Hoke their destination. Unless necessary, the old swordmaster never explained reasoning for direction. He simply expected his words to be followed. Hoke silently ruminated on his moment of victory. In the final waning hours of sunlight, he'd reached the summit and presented his stone, completing the goal and graduating from cadet to ranger. Additionally, he received commendations for successfully evading the rangers prowling the mountainside forest, further sparking rumors of cheating among the other cadets. Hoke gritted his teeth in annoyance. He'd done it his way, on his own, and without magic, but still he was haunted by the specter of his family legacy. "You're chewing on that like it's a poorly cooked flank steak, mate," said Corso, breaking the silence. "Either swallow it or spit it out, yeah?" "If it were that simple," replied Hoke with a sigh. Using a long stick, Corso prodded a burning log. It rolled over, revealing its glowing underside. New flames burst into life as the bark caught fire. The gentle evening breeze teased the flames into greater heights, casting a flickering display of shadows onto the face of the boulder behind their camp. "The house of Kellan is more than your father, Hoke," replied Corso. "Ordwalk may seek to design his legacy, but it would require your complicity if he were unable to trap you against a wall. If you wish to escape the shadow of your father, you must know his plans and frustrate them." The old captain's mind was as sharp as the blade at his side. He had always admonished Hoke to observe first and act only with verified intelligence. Even from afar, Corso continued to observe Terence. Though they lived in a remote cabin in the mountain wilderness, he regularly received communications from his staff in the tower. "I haven't spoken to my father in years," replied Hoke. "I'm fine with keeping it that way." "Ordwalk is plotting to keep you close to Terence," said Corso. "You're his prize stallion, the future of his house." "No," said Hoke, shaking his head. "Hawk is the heiress of Kellan. Her children will be the future of our house." Corso held up a finger. "As heiress, your sister is outside of your father's control. He won't put all his gold on that wager. It's a certainty that Ordwalk has already compiled a short list of high potential matches for you. He's too old himself to sire any more heirs, but not too old to feasibly see your children age into maturity. He was raised by his grandfather, after all. The more children you have, the more targets he has to set his barbs and extend his plans to the next generation of your house. As far as his plans go, it would at least be a comfortable life for you," said Corso with a chuckle. Hoke shook his head. He hadn't returned to Terence since the day Corso had taken him under his tutelage. The grizzled old captain had appeared one day and told Hoke that the young man was to accompany him into the mountains north of Terence. When Hoke had asked why, Corso had given a rare explanation. "I struck a deal with your father," replied Corso. "I'm to teach you to swing a sword, mate, the way I learned. Now say your goodbyes. It'll be some time before you again see Terence." Hoke spent the next several years in the mountains with Corso. The old ranger taught Hoke everything he knew about tracking, survival, and fighting. Hoke spent countless hours drilling forms with his sword until his arms felt as though they would never rise again. Over time, as his skills developed, he gained strength and confidence. "How do you know all of this?" asked Hoke, snapping back to the present. "The deal I made with your father," answered Corso. "His conditions were that I make you the greatest swordsman in Terence, and that I do not interfere with your assignment afterwards. As captain of the Rangers of Terence, it is my duty to assign missions. Your father knew this and accounted for it. By making it a condition of our terms, he all but announced his future intent to subvert my duty," said Corso. "I also have my own sources placed within Terence. Now, I may not be able to interfere with your father's designs in an official capacity, but I have no compunction with advising you," finished Corso. Hoke chuckled at the loophole logic. "All right, you've given this a lot of thought. What do you advise I do?" "Align yourself with Hawk. She is outside of Ordwalk's control and holds incredible sway over the Conclave. Find a reason, any reason, that keeps you in the field. If the two of you put your heads together, I'm sure you can think of one," said Corso. "Thank you, Corso," said Hoke. "I'll discuss it with Hawk tomorrow. If I had to guess, she's engrossed in a book right now." "You do that, mate," replied Corso, giving another rare smile. "When we first met, you were a broken child, soft clay, good for molding. I've watched you grow into a proper young man and a fierce warrior. I didn't spend all that time training you for that shit father of yours to put you in a display case in Terransay, or worse, for him to begin tearing you down anew. I see more than that for you, Hoke. Much more. I also implore you to study and strengthen your connection to magic through Hawk, said Corso. Hoke moved to protest, but the old captain silenced him with an upraised finger. Listen to an old man, yeah? Said Corso. I've taught you everything I could about the way of the sword, and the way of the land. In both, I encouraged you to keep the skills as a carpenter keeps their tools, honed and ready for use. The more tools you have at your disposal, the greater your chance of survival. Access to spellcraft is a mighty tool, Hoke. You have the will to carry you through, and I can think of no greater tutor than an heiress of Kalan, said Corso. Hoke sighed and pondered the truth of Corso's words. He was no longer the scared child, the failure carrying the weight of his father's shame. He'd overcome much during his years of training. I'll try, said Hoke with a sigh. Corso nodded in affirmation of Hoke's acceptance. I'm proud of you, mate. I know I can be a stern bastard at times. It was necessary. But I'm proud of you, Hoke, truly. I never started a family of my own. Yet I now know the pride of a father. Hoke felt a pang of emotion twist in his chest. Thank you, Corso. I will seek to live in a manner that honors you and your teachings, replied Hoke solemnly. Silence settled over the pair as the fire continued to snap and pop. No further words needed to be said. Hoke turned Corso's words over in his mind. He knew they were true, but echoes of the past still reverberated in his memories. He'd overcome many challenges in his training, but none had inspired a fear so great as confronting the failures of his past. Now. The meadow was idyllic. A narrow creek wound its way between low rock outcroppings and small trees. A great stonewood grew from the center of the meadow. Its old and gnarled roots were visible above the soil. They were twisted and thick, a mass of tangled lifelines seeking water and minerals for the great tree that loomed high overhead. Hoke retrieved his cup from his pack and knelt next to the creek. He kept a wary eye and ear on his surroundings as he drew water from the stream. He drank deeply of the cool water. It was soothing in his raw throat. He had been on the trail for 4 hours since breaking camp. Hoke absent-mindedly scratched his chest while he looked around the meadow. For the better part of the last 2 hours, he had felt a tingling and burning sensation emanating across the skin of his chest. He was unable to identify the cause, but he was certain that it was a warning. Along with the tingling sensation, he had also felt eyes upon him. The now familiar sounds of Daleth cursing and Ka broke the solitude of the peaceful meadow. Hoke sighed in annoyance. He was thoroughly tired of the young Ka's presence. "Good afternoon, sunshine," said Hoke sarcastically as he glanced over his shoulder. Daleth stopped his advance and looked upward to the midday sun. He grumbled in Ka before fixing Hoke with an aggravated glare. "No mantis finds you worthy," growled Daleth. Hoke rolled his eyes. "I'm sure that's it," he replied. "Whatever makes you feel comfortable, mate." Daleth bristled. "This pointless. How much longer? You give up." Hoke stood and turned to face Daleth. "You're the one pissing in their armor," accused Hoke, "because you know as well as I that there is a very old mantis in the forest here with us, and that realization terrifies you." Daleth gritted his teeth as he stared daggers at Hoke, seemingly attempting to bore holes through the Farron with his naked gaze alone. With deliberate slowness, Daleth drew his blade. Hoke took a step back and squared himself to the advancing Ka. "Are you sure you want to do this?" asked Hoke. Daleth leapt forward, his blade extended. Hoke stepped to the side as he drew his sword, easily parrying Daleth's thrust. Daleth continued to press his attack, but Hoke stood his ground, easily defending the Ka warrior's frenzied slashes and thrusts. "Sloppy!" shouted Hoke as he beat back another slashing attack. Daleth growled and redoubled his efforts. Hoke parried with incredible speed, countering each attack and answering in kind. In short order, he had Daleth backing away as he hammered at the red-armored warrior's defense. With a flick of his wrist, Hoke disarmed the Ka. Daleth's sword clattered to the ground amidst the tangled roots of the great stonewood. "You rely too heavily on the first 6 forms," admonished Hoke. "You're in need of practice. I'll bet you've gotten this far through sheer size and strength of arm alone, but I was trained by one far stronger and faster than the likes of you." Hoke sheathed his sword and recovered his pack. "Whether you decide to follow me or not, I don't give a shit. But if you draw steel on me again, I'll end the fight, mate. Permanently." Daleth stared at Hoke from the ground but said nothing in return. Hoke shouldered his pack and disappeared into the tree line encircling the meadow. Daleth cursed under his breath as he worked to recover his sword from within the mass of tree roots. The crossguard had somehow worked itself into a restriction, making the extraction difficult. Daleth gave a mighty pull and the sword broke free. The Ka stumbled backwards and tried to catch his balance, but the tangle of tree roots fouled his footing and he stumbled onto his side, landing heavily on the satchel containing the smoke flares. He quickly spun to his back, fearful of breaking the fragile tubes. A black shape suddenly dropped onto Daleth from the stonewood above. A razor-sharp claw found a weakness in the red armor and pierced Daleth's leg, causing him to scream in pain. The black mantis raised his barbed front legs high into the air. Daleth's scream was cut short in his chest as he felt himself being smashed into the ground. As unconsciousness raced to overtake him, Daleth heard Hoke shouting his name. Thank you for listening. Be sure to like, share, and leave a 5-star review for the show. If you would like a copy of the Unscarred, please see the Amazon link in the show notes. Hardcover, paperback, and digital copies are all available right now. And if you want to email the show, hit me up at erictheunscarred@gmail.com.